start recording. All right. So welcome everybody. So good to see you. Happy Hanukkah. We are doing the third in this series of Torah Tea, and then we'll take a 2-week break, and then we'll be back in January with either a different topic or this one. I'd love to hear from all of you what subjects you're interested in learning. So of course, anyone can jump in at any time, ask any questions. I love dialogue. I love discussion. And I really just want to commend all of us for being here and taking time out on a Wednesday to study Torah. There's so many options of things we could be doing, and this is where we chose to be. And I think that's something fantastic and wonderful. So what's really interesting before I jump into today's class, or when I jumped into today's class, is if you actually read in the Torah portion this week, I was like, all right, what's going to be the woman connection? There is one woman mentioned twice in this Torah portion, literally just her name. Does anyone know who?
Oh, no. It's really been her.
Does anyone know who I'm referring to, or no?
Is woman. It Yehudit?
Nope.
Is it the king's daughter? The king's wife, rather?
Pharaoh? Is that what you mean by the
Yes.
king? No, we don't know who he's married to. Does anyone know, has anyone heard the name Asnat? Does that name ring? Anyone heard that name? All right. So that is Asnat.
Yes, I've heard the name.
Oh, you've heard the name Asnat. But in the Torah, do you know who's Asnat? Does anyone know?
No. Is she related to Potiphar?
Okay, this is great. No, I'm so excited that it's going to be some new information. So there's one woman, her name is just mentioned twice. We know very little about her. You'll see it in the verses, and then I'll tell you any possible thing that we could know about her and where we're going to go with that. But before we jump into that, it was so fascinating. Last class, which I think gave me and maybe all of us a lot to think about, and I said we're going to end up with more questions than answers. Literally that same day, I had another class, not that I gave, that I listened to by one of my mentors and teachers. It was based on a talk of the Rebbe, connecting that Torah portion, which was last week, Vayeshev, to Hanukkah. And I thought that the content of what she taught was really powerful and might help all of us to kind of, we kept throwing around the term, our contemporary brains trying to understand Torah, right? And I just felt like the content of that class was just so powerful to help us as we, take our contemporary brains and go into learning Torah, that I wanted to share that class, that sicha, that talk of the Rebbe with you, and then we'll jump into what I prepared also. I prepared both for today. So, so what I'm going to do, is I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to bring it up on here. And again, at any time, anyone is welcome to unmute, ask any questions, all of that. Okay, so we're going to start with, this is from a talk of the Rebbe, connecting the Torah portion of last week. So even though we're in Mikeitz this week, this is Parshat Vayeshev last week, to Hanukkah. So in last week, right, we spoke about in our class Yehuda and Tamar, and that whole story. And that story came in the Torah reading of last week, smack in the middle of Joseph is thrown into the pit, right? His brothers threw him into the pit. Then we have this little break. We have the story of Yehuda and Tamar, and then it goes back into him going down into Egypt and being sold into the house of Potiphar, right? He was sold as a slave in Egypt. So this verse right over here is right when they throw him into the pit. What does it say? In Hebrew, it says about the brothers, V'kachehu v'yashlichu oso habora v'habor reik ein bo mayim, which you can see here in English, verse 24 in chapter 37. And they took him, referring to the brothers taking Joseph, and they cast him into the pit. Now the pit was empty. There was no water in it. Does that any question comes up for anybody right there, just from reading that verse?
No oil and no to light the candles
In the pit?
Wait, so this is referring to Joseph being thrown into the pit, right? So Joseph is, right, are you familiar with that story? His brothers being jealous? Yeah. So when it talks about them throwing him into the pit, it says they took him, they cast him into the pit. Now the pit was empty. There was no water in it. Right?
But why would they dig a pit? Because pits were usually, didn't they dig for wells to have water in the desert? So
Right.
why, like Mitten is there a pit in the middle of the desert with no reason for it?
Well, they're not, I don't think they're necessarily in the middle of the desert. But I guess you're saying, right? So it's almost like a pit that could have been used for a well, but there was no water in the well, right?
Right.
But if you look at the verse, yeah.
Well, did the brothers dig the pit specifically to put him in there?
That's a really good question.
No,
I don't know.
he was there. He was there.
Yeah, I don't think they dug it. There was a pit there.
There was already a pit.
The pit was empty. So the question on this verse is, it says the pit was empty. There was no water in it. Now, if a pit's empty, there's no water in it, right? The Torah doesn't have to tell us that, right? It's pretty obvious. It seems like redundant. The pit's empty. There's no water in it. There's nothing in it. It's empty, right? So it's kind of seems like, why is the Torah saying this like extra part of it? It's empty and there's no water in it. So Rashi stops and asks this exact question, and this actually comes from the Gemara. So we see here, the pit was empty. There was no water in it. Since it says, now the pit was empty, do I not know that there was no water in it? For what purpose did the Torah write there was no water in it? Okay, to inform us. So what's the reason that there was no water in it, but there were snakes and scorpions? Okay, so there was something.
How is that? That's an extrapolation that's interesting to me. I'm not doubting Rashi. I'm just wanting to understand how you segue from no water to snakes and scorpions.
Okay, so in the Talmud, it says that there were snakes and scorpions in the pit. Okay, so right, which is oral Torah. So how that was like passed down, how that became known, right? So Rashi is saying, okay, we know there's snakes and scorpions, but the Torah says the pit was empty, there was no water in it. So Rashi kind of like brings from the Talmud here to say there was no water in it, but there was snakes and scorpions.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. So Rashi is like the, in a way, seems like this like basic commentary on Torah, but actually it seems like just kind of like helping us understand what's going on, right? When there's like this very obvious question, but actually with the Rebbe's talks, he illuminates actually how deep Rashi really is. And even though, in certain senses where it seems like Rashi is so quote unquote basic, but really so much deeper to learn from it. Okay. So we learn that there was no water in it, but there were snakes and scorpions. So now the question is, why is the Gemara, the place where the Talmud, Gemara and Talmud, okay, I'm going to use those interchangeably. Why is the Talmud bringing the explanation about the pit being empty in the section where it's talking about Hanukkah? So what's happening is if you go into the Talmud in that section, right, you see over here where it says Shabbos 22a and Chagiga 3a, right? So it's talking about Hanukkah. And then it says, and the pit, there was like snakes and scorpions in it. It wasn't just empty, there were snakes and scorpions in it, okay? So a very, very, very basic answer is that the same rabbi that was talking at the time that he's talking about Hanukkah, who's like writing this explanation about Hanukkah, he's also the one that shared this explanation about the pit. In other words, it's like the same author, okay? Not a very satisfying answer, right? We know that Torah is a lot deeper than that, and things go much deeper than such a basic answer. So there has to be a connection between the content, between the message, not just the author, right? So there's going to be a connection between Hanukkah and this verse in the Torah that is explained in the Talmud in the middle of Hanukkah, okay? And not to mention that this Torah portion falls out in Hanukkah, right? So there's got to be a connection between, we actually have a teaching from the Shalah HaKodesh that all the Torah portions that are surrounding a Jewish holiday have a connection to that holiday. So there's a connection between this Parshat Vayeshev, and Hanukkah, not just the fact that it's the same author, but something much more, something about the message there, okay? So now to be able to appreciate that, we have to look at another teaching from the Talmud that our sages tell us about this pit being empty, okay? So in another place in the Talmud, in Bava Kama 17a, it says, Ein mayim ela Torah. There is no water except for Torah, right? In other words, just like water is a thing of sustenance, just like fish can't live without water, right? Torah is our water. It is our our life force. It is something we can't live without. That concept. Hold on. Okay. So when the verse says the pit was empty, it had no water in it, it refers to Torah. In other words, the pit was empty, there was no Torah in it. Okay. So the Midrash says it's not really talking about, that it's really talking about Torah. Like we're talking about the physical pit and the water and the snakes and the scorpions, but it's actually saying it wasn't just that there was no physical water in the pit, there was no Torah in this pit, meaning the pit of Yaakov was emptied out. Okay, which means, what does that mean? So the first explanation that yes, it was empty of water, but it was full of snakes and scorpions, is connected to the second explanation that yes, it was empty of water, water referring to Torah. There's a connection between the two. So the connection is that if a person is lacking in their knowledge of Torah, in their words of Torah, in their connection to godliness, to Torah being God's wisdom and godliness, then automatically that situation brings them to that automatically brings in snakes and scorpions. In other words, if you're not fully connected to your source of Mayim, Torah, then automatically there's snakes and scorpions. There's no middle ground. You're not just like in a neutral place, right? Where someone could say like, I'm just, I'm doing great things in the world. It's just Torah's not for me, or Torah, I'm just not so connected to that, or something like that. If you're not, it's kind of like if you're not for it, you're automatically against it, so to speak. And I'm going to explain what that means more. But it's kind of like, as a kid, we were always taught like if you're not going up the escalator, you're automatically going down. Kind of like I think of it as, if you ever as a kid like ran up the down escalator, right? You have to like keep working, because if you give up for a moment, you go right back down, right? So it's kind of like we were always like taught that in this idea that we always have to be working on our self-growth. We can never just be like, I'm good now, right? Like I've reached a good spot, because we just start sliding. Like there's either we're going up or we're going down. There's no neutral, okay? So the Baal Shem Tov taught us actually that as soon as a Jewish person moves away from cleaving to Hashem, from cleaving to godliness, they automatically enter into a state of avodah zarah, which literally is idol worship, but it means just anything that's opposite God. In other words, either we're filling ourselves with godliness or the opposite is going to seep in. Okay. Now, that's a really powerful and strong statement, right? To say there's no neutral space. If you're not going up, you're going down, right? That seems like a little bit extreme. Okay.
Can I ask one just quick question, kind of a philosophical question?
Absolutely.
About the concept of moves away from cleaving to, or lacking in their words and knowledge. It leaves me with a feeling of can't win, because I don't know what that means. It's defined in a philosophical way and open to somebody else's interpretation, much less you saying to yourself, wait a minute, did I do enough mitzvot today? Did I light enough candles? Did I serve enough chicken soup? So can you unpack that a little bit?
Yeah, I want to suggest that this might actually be good that it's vague, because it does leave it up to each of us, sort of like to do your own introspection, to do your own right? Because it's not like, well, you got to learn this amount, like here, here's the quantifiable amount, or here's like, how could we judge? One of the premises of like not being able to judge anybody is like, we don't know people's relationship with God. We don't know what's going on. We don't know what their challenges are, right? So it's almost like, I want to say on purpose, let's not have a quantifiable, like, here's how you know if you're good, because it's for each of us to look into our side of ourselves and ask ourselves that question.
So you think we're our own personal judges. We decide. It's a personal integrity issue.
Yes and no, because I would say yes. And Torah does, the Rebbe spoke about many times having a mentor and checking in with somebody else, right? Because we are too close to ourselves. So it's a constant combination, I would say.
Interesting. Yeah. Thank you.
So yes, we do want someone outside of ourselves to guide us. And at the same time, we want to ask ourselves this question, but there isn't like a one size fits all answer to how you know if you're like sufficiently involved in Torah, right? Especially because there is no such thing. Again, it's like that moving escalator, right? You want to always be, I'll give you actually a very personal example in my life. I just wonder if I should do that a little bit later in the class or right here. I'm not sure. I'm going to just address, Debbie asked in the chat, like Hanukkah happened so much later than the Torah portion, 100%. But as we know, Torah and Judaism and all of our practice, it's like one big moving organism, right? And it's really all connected. And the Rebbe really showed us how everything's connected. So yes, even though Hanukkah happened much later, there's this powerful connection between Hanukkah and this Torah portion that we can learn about. You're going to find out about it right here. Okay. I'll give you my personal example of like where I see this, but I want to continue a little bit more. So let's go back to the brothers. Because the brothers were lacking in their Torah, okay, we're going to talk about what that means. It brought in the snakes and scorpions, meaning the brothers did something against what Hashem would want them to do, which is they went and they sold Yosef. Okay. And how did they fall? Like, how did they fall to that level? How does that fit into the story? That's our question here, right? So yes, a person can cut themselves off from Torah. Someone can move away from godliness. Maybe that could even make someone do something extreme, right? But in this case, we're talking about the tribes, right, who are certainly involved in Torah. And not only that, this was a Torah conclusion for them. They were sitting and discussing Torah. And according to them, they're like, Joseph is deserving of death because of the things he's done and the way he put himself above everybody else. And they were having a Torah conclusion, like, what should we do with someone like Joseph and the things he's been doing, right? They came to a conclusion. It was a wrong conclusion, but they came to a Torah conclusion that Joseph was deserving of death. So how could we say they were empty of Torah? They were basing themselves off of Torah. Okay? So why is it that just because a person is lacking in Torah, that they'll automatically end up in opposition to Torah? And how can we say that about such righteous people? We're talking about the brothers, the Shvatim, the tribes, right? How can we say that about them, right? So what's interesting is that here in this case, Torah is being compared to water. Now, Torah is compared to lots of different things in different places in Judaism. You'll find a place where Torah is compared to bread, compared to wine, compared to oil. Each time it's compared to something, it's highlighting that specific connection in that area. And here we're highlighting the connection to water, right? In the Talmud, it explains why is Torah connected to water. So just like water comes from a high place and it goes down to a low place. So let's say rain, right? High to above. A spring of water, a waterfall. Like water is just known as something that has its sources high and it comes down low. So too, what is the way that we are meant to learn Torah? Torah is such a high, it's godliness. It's godly wisdom. It is give me some words. It's infinite, right? How could us, infinite human beings learning Torah, how do we make it last? If we put ourselves into a low place. In other words, if we completely nullify and submit, the word nullify, I don't feel like what is that? But it's like completely submitting ourselves to God and his Torah. The Hebrew word for that is bittul. Anyone have like a good word for what that is? Like when you're just like, it's not about me. It's like egoless. It's not like you have to like take yourself out of the picture to really understand.
Humility.
Humility. It's even more than humility. It's like, okay. I'll without one word, I'll put it in a sentence for you in a minute. Okay. So this is the message from the story. The brothers had lost the level of bittul of this. I don't have a good one word for it, but complete submission. They lost their level of submission that is required of a Jew to truly be connected to Torah. And obviously when I say this, I just mean in a relevant sense, because what's expected, we said that like God expects according to who you are. And we're talking about tzaddikim here, the very, very, very righteous brothers. And so in the relevant sense, in relevant to what is expected of them, they were held to a higher standard. They're not like regular people. And compared to the standard that was expected of them, they had lost that sense of bittul, that sense of complete submission. Okay? Actually, in the laws of Shmona Esrei, the Amidah prayer, right? We have a few times we bow. We say Baruch Atah Hashem, and we bow, and then we straighten back up. A king, when he bows in Shmona Esrei, he stays bowed. because it's like he's held to a higher standard of submission, of taking himself out of the picture, so to speak. So the level of bittul that the brothers were supposed to achieve was very, very high, very, very thorough, and they missed that level. So because the pit was empty, meaning empty of the proper level of Torah, what happened? Snakes and scorpions came in. They were able to go to this place of selling their own brother. They came to an improper evaluation that Joseph was deserving of death. How did they get to that improper evaluation? Because they were missing that bittul. Let me just think. Okay. Diane, is it clear? Is the audio clear?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. I wasn't sure if someone. All right. So now the question is, the brothers were definitely involved in Torah, right? We said they were having a Torah discussion. So now it's like, really, just because you don't have enough of that bittul, that's enough to draw in snakes and scorpions, right? It's a very, very powerful message that we get here. That this message we have so much in the world, like again, our contemporary minds fighting against this mindset. Okay, but we can bring about it because it's hard. But we have to really understand that Torah is Hashem's Torah. It is God's Torah. The giver of the Torah. God is the Notain HaTorah, the giver of the Torah. And it doesn't make any sense for a human brain to comprehend an infinite godly wisdom. Okay? The only way is if we have this extreme bittul. If it's like, here's the phrase. The only way our human mind can understand God's Torah is if we put aside our human mind. Our catch-22 over here. Okay? It's like unfathomable that we could even think to understand such an infinite thing, yet that's exactly what God wants us to do. God wants us to delve into this infinite godly wisdom that is so hard for our human brain to comprehend. And how could we even possibly come to comprehend it? Only because God enables us to, and only when we take ourselves out of the picture. Okay? That's how we have to connect to the Notain HaTorah, the giver of the Torah. And otherwise, it's not Torah anymore. Otherwise, we're not grasping godliness. Yes, Debbie.
Is it the same as covenant?
Say it again.
Is it the same as covenant?
So
No.
kavanah is intention, mindfulness, right? So that's like when we're praying, when we have kavanah, it's like I'm paying attention to what I'm doing. This bittul is like, sorry, go ahead.
It's also intent.
Yeah, right. So intent, 100%, it's intent. And I feel like intent puts us in it, which is beautiful and necessary. Bittul takes you out of it. Okay? It's
So Adina,
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
way I see this is that you can't understand Torah. It's not a mind thing. Your understanding of Torah has to come from your neshama. It's a soul thing. It's the connection with God, with your soul. It's not an intellectual pursuit.
Yeah.
It's
So
us.
we're gonna exactly that is what we're gonna talk about. Like, is it or isn't it? Because it also seems like it is, right? So
Well,
there's
on
this,
some level, yes, it's intellectual when you sit and study Gemara and all that kind of stuff. You're analyzing, but when you get down to the essence,
yeah,
we're absorbing it in our souls.
yes,
And I think can relate that back to the bittul. It's I know when we at Pesach,
yeah,
bittul is involved when you burn the last of the chametz. You're
right.
nullified.
Chametz is it rises, right? It's like I have an existence. I'm a me. It's ego, right? And matzah is flat, where we take ourselves out of the picture.
Right.
Yes.
So if you don't have bittul, you're too much into your ego, and you're not enough into your essence, who you really are. It's almost like God forgive me. It's like you're putting yourself before Hashem.
Yeah.
It's like you think you know more than Hashem.
Right.
But when you're really into this, you realize that you have no control, and it's coming from God.
Mm-hmm.
Can I add something to Tessa's really deep interpretation? Thank you for that. This brings me back to the idea, I've spoken about this before, but it's really fundamental to me, is the idea that we're made in the image of God and that God has no image. So, and we're forbidden even to make an image.
Mm-hmm.
So the image that we're made in is what God is, but we're made of God. So I don't think it's that we can't be divine. I think it's that we impact our divinity with our intellect sometimes, with our choices sometimes, but we are comprised of intellect and divinity. That is the image of God, and a body. That is the whole package. So all three of those things are balanced, take into consideration how we're gonna perform our mitzvot, how we're gonna be. I'm not convinced that, I don't know what self-abnegation means, because I can't imagine that we would be created and then be told to self-abnegate for any reason. I think it's more a compilation, a bringing together of your own wisdom. What is that? The chachma and remember all those things we talked about, the different parts of the being?
Yeah.
Goes together in service of goodness.
Yeah.
I'll stop my monologue. But anyway, it's
definitely a fascinating conversation. These days, my favorite word is "and," because I know that was very deep, because it's like learning how to have bittul, how to really submit ourselves over to God, and how to be. But I'm a person. I'm an existence. Is that happening on my end?
I think I have a slightly different.
No, it's not. But if you mute everybody, Adina, it won't happen. If you mute everybody.
Okay, I'm gonna mute everybody. Unmute yourself if you're gonna say something. Okay, so it's like and is like you can hold two opposites in your hand at the same time. It's like a paradox, and yet we're trying to find the balance between the two. So like that self-abnegation, it's hard to really understand what that means, but like
it's not that hard.
It's not a bad word?
No, it's not that hard. If sometimes if you're a creative person, say, or you're a writer, or you're doing some kind of research, it's a place that you can go to sometimes, and yourself isn't involved. You paint things you don't know how to paint. You know things that you don't know. And it's like in a popular and sort of tacky parlance, it would be like, going with the flow.
Mm-hmm.
It's when you go away.
Right. So it's kind of right. It's like taking yourself out of the picture. And there's so many different examples, but just
exactly.
This one comes to mind of like, right. It's a mitzvah on Yom Kippur to fast. So let's say there's someone who's like, I want to fast. I want to fast. It's a holy day. I want to spend my day in prayer. I want to connect with God. Right. And then their doctor says you can't fast. It's not healthy for you. And then you call a rabbi, a rav, and he says, no, if your doctor said you can't fast, you can't fast. And you're like, no, but I want to do this mitzvah. I want to fast. I want to connect with God. I want to pray, right? So it might require bittul. Like, this isn't about you. God doesn't want you to fast. No matter how spiritual you're going to feel, no matter how much you desire it, no matter, like, it might require bittul to be like, no, your job right now is to eat. That is how you're going to connect to God. That is your mitzvah of Yom Kippur. You are sinning. I don't even like that word, but right? Like you're going against by choosing to fast. In other words, it requires bittul to do what God wants across the board, because our own selves can get in the way of it. At the same time, of course, our own selves matter, right? So that's where the and comes in. It doesn't mean like we're nothing. Like if anything, the opposite. God gave each of us a personality and talents and says, use those, right? Use those in the world. Use those to serve God. Yeah, it's definitely, something that we can continuously bring about, because it's a fascinating concept and discussion to have, right? So it's an amazing phenomenon is happening here, that a human mind is going to grasp Hashem, and only because he lets us. And only having this concept of bittul can we actually tap into that, right? So even in your imagination, you can't imagine a huge elephant going into the eye of a needle, right? In your imagination, to make that happen, either the elephant is shrinking or the eye of the needle is getting bigger. Our mind can't understand it otherwise. And if that's true of an elephant, how much more so is it true about God, right? We're talking about the ultimate of infinity. God being grasped by our limited human physical mind is unfathomable. And the only reason, again, that it could even happen is because God allows it, wants it, and with this level of bittul. Okay?
I also have to disagree that it doesn't involve the intellect, because I think it does. I think it involves the intellect pushed to the point where you're beyond it.
100% it involves the intellect. That's where the and goes.
Rashi, why would we have Rashi if it didn't involve the intellect?
Say it again?
It absolutely involves the intellect.
100%.
It involves
Right now, we're
pushing
all
beyond
using our
it.
intellect, right? All of us.
Exactly right.
We're going to get there a little bit more. And yes, Debbie, bittul is a Hebrew word, bitul. It has actually the same letters as the word tefillah, which is when we dip in the mikvah. Tefillah is to immerse, has the same letters as bittul, especially because mikvah is a mitzvah that has no rational, logical explanation, right? It requires bittul. Very interesting. So yes, we're going to talk about that, Adrian, that it is an intellectual experience. So what's interesting is, in our morning prayers, we have a blessing that we say every single day. Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu. I just lost my train of thought. Notein HaTorah. Asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu. Notein HaTorah, right? We say it every day in our morning prayers. Okay. Sorry, I was mixing up two different ones. Asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu al divrei Torah is a blessing on the words of Torah. And then we also have Notein HaTorah, right? So the only time a person that has to make this blessing, this Notein HaTorah blessing, is when they're actually going to utter words of Torah. So in other words, if I'm lying in my bed in the morning, right, I'm allowed to just think words of Torah. I can think about my Torah Tea today. I can think about a Torah concept without making this blessing. But once you're going to verbalize Torah, you have to make this blessing first. Well, that's why it's part of our morning blessings, right? And even better than just verbalizing words of Torah, it's actually a whole body process. Like we said before, it is an intellectual experience. We actually want to use our lips and utter it, right? Like when I'm praying, I do this with my kids all the time, right? I don't pray silently like that. I would say the words a little bit. Right? Like you are whispering. Same thing with Torah. You want to utter the words of Torah. It's a whole, you use your lips, you use your mouth, you use your mind. It's a whole body experience. Okay? So why, when studying Torah, do we have to actually verbalize it, right? Why isn't the intellectual part of it enough? Why can't we just comprehend it, right? If my kids are studying math or science, I don't care if they say out loud the thing, right? Like if I say, I'm making this up, right? But what's 4 + 4? They don't have to say 4 + 4 is 8. They could just say 8 or whatever. Like they just need to understand it. They don't have to like verbalize each part of it, or with science or with any subject, right? Why is the verbalization of Torah so important to it? And actually, if anything, right, we do put such an emphasis on the intellectual, especially when it's oral Torah, Midrash, Talmud. That is a huge intellectual experience, right? So the answer here is it is an intellectual experience, but a requirement is for it to be verbalized, because the bottom line is that it's not only an intellectual experience. It doesn't make any sense, okay? And it doesn't make sense for it to make sense, again, because it's such a godly thing, something so beyond our own physical minds. It's a whole body experience that we have to give ourselves over to with this bittul, with this level of submission. And only then does it become part of us. If we don't verbalize Torah, this is actually a concept. If we don't verbalize Torah, we end up forgetting it, right? There's a concept like my kids learn a lot of things by heart because, right, so that wherever you go, you have Torah on your mind, right? It's this idea of constant review that you have to do. Yes, Debbie. You want to unmute yourself? Do you have a question? Where are you, Debbie? There you are. You're muted. You're muted. We can't hear you, Debbie.
Oh, sorry.
There you go.
Okay.
Now we can hear you. Start over.
Just want to go back to what you were saying about the blessing that's in on Torah and the morning prayers. When we study Torah, before we study Torah, we always say the blessing for study, also B'di B'rei Torah. So I'm just curious why, like in this class, for instance, when we're doing the study, why don't we start with that blessing to study Torah when we're doing this?
We absolutely could. We could absolutely start our Torah and Teas with the blessing. I say it in my, like, every morning before I eat, there's like some parts of our prayer that we say. So it's included in our morning prayers, that because it's like I start off my day with that blessing, because hopefully, right, we try to learn Torah every day, and then it like kind of covers your Torah learning for the day by making that blessing. But we can absolutely start off our Torah and Teas with making that blessing.
Okay.
And if I forget, just remind me. It's not like on the forefront of my mind because I said it in the morning.
Okay.
But that's a fantastic
Adina,
suggestion. Yeah.
I have a thought about why we say it out loud.
Yeah.
We are a people of doing. We are a people of action.
Mm-hmm.
When we are created in God's image, as my husband likes to say, we have to do God. We have to do godly things.
Yes.
We have to give tzedakah. We have to take care of others. So we are a people of doing, and by verbalizing our prayers, it's not just the intellect of reading them, but we're giving it the spoken word, which is very powerful.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely.
Isn't our prime directive to make holiness manifest in this world?
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
saying it makes it more concrete.
Yes. So yeah, 100%. It's like a way of bringing it into, right? We have to get out of our brain and out of just our intellectual experience and into our body. We have to use the lower parts of ourselves, exactly like you said. First of all, number one, that's our job in this world, right? But for Torah to come from a high place to a low place, we have to put ourselves in a low place. We have to use the lower parts of ourselves. We have to use, like, all of us in order to like achieve that, right? So so if a person is lacking in that water of Torah, in that bittul to Torah and what it is, then automatically we get to this place of snakes and scorpions, right? Torah is water means having bittul. Understanding Torah and our relationship with Hashem makes no sense unless we have that bittul, okay? So let's just say someone is lacking that, right? Our own human understanding of things can creep back in. We can kind of intellectualize Torah. That's where we're susceptible to snakes and scorpions. That's what happened with the brothers, because they had lost that level. They had lost that level of bittul. Therefore, they were making a mistake, right? So in other words, it's like this dichotomy, because if our logical mind comes along and says, this doesn't make sense, this doesn't add up, what's going on over here? As soon as that happens, it's snakes and scorpions. And again, it also depends kind of where you're coming from, right? Because I also want to say, of course, I don't mean like to negate questions. We always want to question things, but it's different than when the logical mind is kind of coming in to negate it, right? To negate the fact that it's God's Torah. There's a notain HaTorah. There's a giver of Torah here. And to kind of see it from that place. And that is where our logical minds can lead us astray. And this is exactly, right? So now we're like, well, how does this all connect to Hanukkah? Why did the Talmud bring this whole, this idea here of the pit being empty and empty of water, and water is Torah, right? Because right here in the explanation of Hanukkah, this is exactly the message of Hanukkah. What did the Greeks want? They wanted the Jews to forget Torah Secha. There's like a special prayer we add for Hanukkah in our after we eat and in our daily prayers and everything. And in it, it talks about what the Greeks wanted. They wanted the Jews to forget your Torah, meaning God's Torah. The Greeks had no issue with the Jewish people immersing themselves in the intellectual pursuit of Torah. They were like, this is great, wonderful, use your mind. What they wanted to do is to take the Torah out of Torah, the godliness out of Torah, right? Learn Torah as an intellectual pursuit. We're here to fight against the Torah of Torah. And that's why they went into the Holy Temple. And listen, they could have like thrown out the oil. That's not what they did. They defiled the oil, right? Because the oil had to be sealed, pure olive oil, sealed with the stamp of the Kohen Gadol, the high official in the Holy Temple. They were like, this business of it has to be pure. And like, let's take the purity out of this Judaism. We're going to defile it. We're going to make it impure. That's all they wanted to do. They wanted to like, let's take godliness out of this whole concept. Let's take purity out of it. Let's take holiness. Let's take the notain haTorah out of it. The truth is that a community, when they came back into the Holy Temple, they found lots of impure olive oil and only one jug of pure olive oil. Now, think about it. Really, in that situation, if a community has no olive oil, couldn't they have just used the impure olive oil? They could still light the menorah. Just light it with the impure oil. Like, you don't have your pure oil, fine. But if you want to go and rededicate the temple, light the menorah, use what you have, right? But no, the whole point, it would not have brought out the highlight of the victory. The victory was we are going to hold on to our holiness and our purity, the irrational mitzvot we do. We're going to go back to using mikvah and doing circumcisions and keeping Shabbat. So they're like, no, we're not going to use impure olive oil. And it's because of that desire for their Jewish purity that God performed the miracle for them. Think about it. We could have not had Hanukkah. They could have just lit the menorah with the oil they had and there would have been oil, right? But they didn't want to do that. They wanted the purity of it, the part that doesn't make sense. And because of that, we merited the miracle that the oil lasted for 8 days. Okay. And so that's just like this really, I just thought it was so fascinating that the way to prevent this like negativity from sneaking in, the snakes and scorpions, is with this like concept. It's not about my understanding, even with the intellectual experience of Torah. I put myself aside to open myself up to God, right? So again, it's like this dichotomy. And what happens when we light the menorah? What are we doing when we light that pure oil? When we recognize that we're here to learn God's Torah bigger than my understanding, it's unbelievable that God gives us this ability to connect to something so infinite. That itself is the gift, that me and my limited human mind can connect to something so powerful and so infinite. Okay, I am going to stop sharing my screen to just open it up to what is everyone's thoughts or questions. I was just so like, wow, it just really helped me because, you know, especially in the book of Bereshit, and, you know, there's so many stories to grapple with. There's a lot of stuff that it's like, you know, that my human mind wants to be like, this doesn't make sense. And why would this? And why this? And right. And it was just such a powerful reminder of like, what, you know, what I am in relation to Torah, what we're learning, what, all of that. So I want to hear from you. What thoughts came to mind or any questions?
It seems like to me that the opposite of having Torah is much worse than not having Torah, because without Torah, we introduce scorpions and snakes. It's worse than bad. It's worse than neutral.
Well, that's the thing. Like, there's not really a neutral ground, right? It's like either you're going up or you're going down. Now, I don't mean that in a negative way. I don't ever want to focus on the negative. I think if anything, what I would want to take away from that is we always want to be learning more. We always want to be working on ourselves. We always want to be improving. Like, there's no arrived ever. That's just like not what life is about, right? And so the pit is empty. There is no water in it. Is in order to, right? We want to fill the pit, fill our pits with water, with Torah, with that, and that level of Torah learning. Okay, anything else before we actually go to today's lesson?
I just wanted to talk about the word arrive when you say there's no arrive, Adina.
Yeah.
And I know exactly what you're saying. Maybe do you mean final arrival or a place where we stop? I think we do have places of landings where we do land, we do arrive, we do have accomplishments, we do have completions, we do have mitzvot completed, we do have incredible things like getting a child off to college, like, you know, completing a program. Or, I mean, we have many arrivals and they're all important. I think what you're saying is it doesn't stop. It's
Yeah,
like,
I think, I mean, like in self-growth, like, yeah,
Right,
you
yeah.
you accomplish one thing. Like, let's just say, thoughts that come to mind for me. So funny. I just remember struggling with this one thing in high school and talking to my mentor about it. And she was like, this might be what you're going to struggle with your whole life. She's like, or you won't, and you'll just have something else when this one's, you know, when you overcome this struggle. Like, it was just sort of like, there's always going to be something else, right? And like, we're going to either work through this, or we're going to, or like, I remember actually my first question to my mentor was that I said, I feel like I'm very judgmental of the other girls in my class. And right, so she was just kind of, I mean, in many ways she helped me through that, but she was just like, right, so you're going to either work through, how do I become a non-judgmental person? And I think I did work on that tremendously, but of course I have more work to do. Like, I don't think but even if I did work through that, then there's something else to work on. Like, we're never really done. But, oh, this is what I was going to say previously about this idea of that there's no neutral, and we're either growing in our Torah or this idea of other thoughts seeping in and all of that. I don't remember exactly. No, I was going to say it's in connection to something, but I love listening to a lot of like Torah classes and learning and all of that, but especially since I have gotten into coaching, I love listening to like all these like self-help podcasts and books and coaching podcasts, right? And it's like, it seems like it's great. It's all helpful. It's all gonna, you know, just increase my emotional resilience or my tools for my clients or whatever it is. And so I have been having lots of discussions with my mentors about it, right? Like, is there anything wrong with it, or is it so great? But at the same time, it's like, that's sometimes more exciting maybe than this other Torah learning podcast or whatever. And we you know, I've had a lot of interesting discussions about it. And at the end of the day, they're both amazing and incredible, but Torah, and I feel it when I listen to the I can feel the difference. Torah is MS. Torah is truth. When I'm listening to a Torah class or I'm opening up a Torah book, I'm connecting to MS, Emet. I'm connecting to eternal truth. When I'm listening to a self-help podcast, right, and psychology, it's beautiful ideas, it's amazing concepts, but I'm not connecting to MS, to godliness, to like the truth and the foundations of the world. And it's all wonderful. This doesn't mean that there's not truth within that, but I just have to always remember, right? What is real? What is, like, in other words, I don't know if I'm conveying the message as much, but I guess I would say when the self-help stuff is an intellectual pursuit, right? But it has a lot of me. I can understand it, and I want to understand it, and I need to understand it. Whereas Torah, we said, again, is so much more than that. You're connecting to something so much higher, and it doesn't have to all make sense. It doesn't all need to be an intellectual pursuit. So I'm connecting with something like, I guess, like Tessa said, my neshama. That's like one part of you. It's like feeding your neshama, really. So it's just to keep in mind. My mentor told me, like, keep in mind, again, yes, you could read these things and listen to these things, and they're wonderful, but it's never Torah. Even when you're like, oh my gosh, this concept is in Tanya, which is all the way. I'm always like, wait, this is in Tanya. Wait, this is in Chassidus. Wait, this is in Torah. She's like, yes, but you're not learning Torah when you're doing it that way. Remember that, right? So anyway, and I feel it. Like, I can completely feel difference, and sometimes I'm like, okay, too much of the coaching podcast, like I need to take a break from it. I want to like completely submerge myself in some Tanya classes, right? Because I sense the difference. I feel it. So anyways,
I would like to say something, Adina.
Yeah.
Okay. It's a new say. I'm sure all of us are all good reader and know his podcast become the library, we'll say. But it's always a warning. Before you read a book, or when you love a book, or when you don't like the book, you have to know the author. Because where it comes from, if it's a girl or a man, if it's something written 50 years ago today, it gives you an appreciation of where it comes from. And I think this is the key of just what you're explaining. When we learn Torah, or all book Hasidut, or any learning we have that is inspired from the world of Torah, we not only learning about the author, we're connecting to the author. because the Torah is divine. The Torah is godliness. And I think when you read a book on, like you say, about self-help and all this coaching and everything, is pertaining to that person that is giving you to all this helpful link or hit or what to do, but is connected to the experience of that person. When you learn about Torah, you're connecting to us and it's connected to your essence.
Mm-hmm. Right. So when we connect to the Torah, exactly, we're connecting to the Notain HaTorah, the giver of the Torah. Exactly. Beautiful. Okay. I'm going to share my screen again, and we are going to jump into the one woman mentioned twice in this week's Torah portion. Okay. So the Torah portion in a nutshell. Does someone else want to read for me? Jolie, do you want to read the portion in a nutshell? Here, let me.
All right. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay. Parsha in a nutshell. Joseph's imprisonment finally ends when Pharaoh dreams of 7 fat cows that are swallowed up by 7 lean cows, and of 7 fat ears of grain swallowed by 7 lean ears. Joseph interprets the dreams to mean that 7 years of plenty will be followed by 7 years of hunger, and advises Pharaoh to store grain during the plentiful years. Pharaoh appoints Joseph the governor of Egypt. Joseph marries Asnath, daughter of Potiphar, and they have 2 sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. Famine spreads throughout the region, and food can be obtained only in Egypt. 10 of Joseph's brothers come to Egypt to purchase grain. The youngest, Benjamin, stays home, for Jacob fears for his safety. Joseph recognizes his brothers, but they do not recognize him. He accuses them of being spies, insists that they bring Benjamin to prove that they are who they say they are, and imprisons Simeon as a hostage. Later, they discover that the money they paid for their provisions has been mysteriously returned to them. Jacob agrees to send Benjamin only after Judah assumes personal and eternal responsibility for him. This time, Joseph receives them kindly, releases Simeon, and invites them to an eventful dinner at his home. But then he plants his silver goblet, purportedly imbued with magic powers, in Benjamin's sack. When the brothers set out for home the next morning, they are pursued, searched, and arrested when the goblet is discovered. Joseph offers to set them free and retain only Benjamin as his slave.
Okay, so we hear about Asnath. Okay, so I just took the actual verses, and you'll see below where it's highlighted there and here that it actually mentions her name, okay, twice. But this woman, Asnath, is mentioned twice. Do you want to just run through, Robin, do you want to read the English of the verses for us?
Yes, from Mikeitz. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Since God has let you know all this, there is no one as understanding and wise as you. You shall be appointed over my household, and through your command all my people shall be nourished. Only with the throne will I be greater than you." So Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Look, I have appointed you over the entire land of Egypt." And Pharaoh removed his ring from his hand and placed it on Joseph's hand, and he attired him with raiment of fine linen, and he placed the golden chain around his neck. And he had him ride in his chariot of 2nd rank, and they called out before him, "This is the king's patron," appointing him over the entire land of Egypt. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, "I am Pharaoh, and besides you, no one may lift his hand or his foot in the entire land of Egypt." And Pharaoh named Joseph
Safnas Paneach is how it's in the Hebrew. Safnas Paneach, I know.
Paneach. And he gave him Asnath, the daughter of Potiphar, the governor of On, for a wife, and Joseph went forth over the land of Egypt. And Joseph was 30 years old when he stood before Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. And Joseph went out before Pharaoh and passed through the entire land of Egypt. And in the 7 years of plenty, the inhabitants of the land gathered food by handfuls. And he collected all the food of the 7 years that was in the land of Egypt, and he placed food in the cities. The food of the field surrounding the city he put within it. And Joseph gathered grain like the sand of the sea in great abundance, until one stopped counting, because there was no number. And to Joseph were born 2 sons before the year of the famine set in, whom Asenath the daughter of Pharaoh, the governor of On, bore to him. And Joseph named the firstborn Manasseh, for God has caused me to forget all my toil and all my father's house. And the second one he named Ephraim, for God has made me fruitful in the land of my affliction.
Thank you. Okay, so what do we know about Asnat? Who is this Asnat, right? So from the verse, it just seems like Pharaoh named Joseph Tzafnas Paneach, and he gave him Asnat, the daughter of Potiphera. So it's not Pharaoh's daughter. Okay, someone else's daughter. He's giving to Joseph as a wife. Okay, so let's find out. What do we know about it? So this is the Mayim Loez on exactly this verse.
I'm sorry, Adina, question.
Yes.
Is this Potiphar?
Yes.
Okay, so it's Potiphar's daughter.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, we're going to read that right here. Do you want to read that for us, Tessa?
Oh, sure.
Okay.
The name Tzapanach Paneach is derived from the word Safun, meaning hidden. And the two words, Yafanach, meaning easily reveals.
Yeah, just pause for a second. You know, we have like 15 steps in the Seder, the Passover Seder.
Safun is when you look for the Afikomen.
Exactly, hidden, because you hide the Afikomen, right? So Tzafnat comes from the word Safun, meaning hidden. Okay, sorry, go ahead.
That's okay. The name therefore means he who easily reveals the hidden. Potiphar is none other than Joseph's original master, Potiphar. He was one of the rulers of the city of On, Heliopolis. Some say that Potiphar was one of Pharaoh's overseers. However, when he purchased Joseph for his own personal reasons, he became impotent and lost his masculinity. From then on, he was called Potiphera. He was demoted from his position and entered the priesthood. Our sages teach that Asnat was the daughter of Dinah, whom Shechem, son of Hamor, had fathered.
Okay, so now,
whoa,
right, this is Asnat is not. You're gonna see the story right here. But Asnat, when Dinah we did the whole story of Dinah. Dinah was raped by Shechem. She had a baby girl. Okay, go ahead.
Our sages teach that Asnat was the daughter of Dinah, whom Shechem, son of Hamor, had fathered. Jacob had to hide the infant outside of his house since Dinah's brothers wanted to kill her. He kept her hidden under a bush, snake, and for that reason, she was given the name Asnat. Praying for her safety, Jacob hung a gold medallion around her neck, inscribed with the words, "Whoever marries this girl should know that his children will be descendants of Jacob." The archangel Gabriel, and some say Michael, brought Asnat to Egypt, to the house of Potiphar. There she grew up and was raised as his stepdaughter. When Joseph was being led through the capital, as described earlier, all the Egyptian women stood on the roofs where they could see his beauty. Each one threw him the finest gift she could afford in an attempt to attract his attention. Since Asnat had nothing else, she threw Joseph her medallion. Reading it and seeing that she was a descendant of Jacob, Joseph asked for her hand in marriage. According to another version, the writing on the medallion was indecipherable to the Egyptians. When Asnat was in Potiphar's house, she inquired of all the Egyptian wizards to try to understand the strange writing, but no one knew how to read it. Although Joseph lived in the same house, she never asked him to attempt to read it, reasoning that if all the wizards could not decipher it, how could a mere slave?
Do you want to read more, or do you want to pass it on?
And we can pass it.
Okay.
Thank you.
Harriet, do you want to read?
Now, however, Joseph had become famous as a great genius, and he had been named Tzafat Paneach, he who easily reveals the hidden. Potiphar, or Potiphera, therefore brought the medallion to Joseph, hoping that he would be able to read its inscription. Upon seeing it, Joseph showed it to Pharaoh and explained its meaning. Pharaoh understood Joseph's intent, and on the same day he gave permission for Joseph and Asnat to wed. This had all been directed by providence, since God makes the recompense fit. Jacob had hidden Dinah in a chest so that Esau would not see her, and he was punished for doing so, since Dinah could have made Esau change his ways. As a result, Dinah was raped by Shechem. Still, since Jacob's motives had been good, Dinah's child was not allowed to assimilate and become a godless pagan. Providence therefore arranged for Joseph to marry her. This was also due in part to Joseph's own merit. When Jacob encountered Esau, Joseph had stood in front of his mother Rachel so that Esau would not see her. This was something that none of the other brothers did for their mothers. As a result, Joseph was worthy of marrying Asnat, the daughter of Dinah, the daughter whom Jacob had tried to keep him from Esau.
Yeah. To hide from Esau, yeah.
Okay.
And
Though
last little...
Pharaoh was not Dinah's real mother, the Torah refers to her as his daughter. Since he had raised her in his house, she was considered his daughter. This teaches us that when one raises an orphan in his or her house and treats him or her well, he or she is considered to be like one's own child.
Okay, so this is the backstory. I'm going to just go back to the beginning of it. The backstory of who Asnat is, okay? Raised by Potiphar and his wife, but really Dinah's daughter. So yes, Yosef's niece, half-niece, because Dinah is his half-sister or step, right? Like they share a father, not a mother. So Asnat, Yaakov hid Asnat. It's kind of like the original, like leave the baby outside the fire station kind of story. So he hid her by a bush, a thorn bush, which is called a sneh, and that's where she got the name Asnat, comes from that. And an angel escorted her, maybe an angel in human form, I don't know, took her and brought her to Egypt, and she was like adopted into the household of Potiphar. Okay, but before Yaakov did this, he put a medallion on her, and in Hebrew it said, "Whoever marries her will come from, will be part of the descendants of Yaakov." Right. So now she's in Egypt. No one can read it. No one knows what it says. No one knows what it's talking about. And she just kind of like had this, you know, like the like what is it, like friendship brace necklaces, right, where it's like I have half the heart and you have the other half, and it's like you got to get to fit. So like she had this thing on her, and she didn't know what it meant or who it came from or anything, and she didn't even think. And so what's fascinating, it's kind of like the romantic story, she was in the same household as Joseph. Joseph's a slave in the house that she's a adopted daughter in. She didn't even think to ask him what it means, because she like asked all the Egyptian sorcerers and wizards, and none of them knew. So she was like, why would I ask this slave, right? Then he gets thrown into the dungeon. He gets promoted to second to the king. And she, you know, and I guess when, I don't know, when there's someone as a king or being promoted or whatever, everyone's like, it was a custom that the women are all like throwing their jewelry. Yosef was also very beautiful, and they wanted to get his attention. And so they're like, you know, throwing all their stuff at him, and she doesn't have anything to throw. So she throws her medallion, and he catches it. He reads this. Whoever marries this girl should know that his children will be descendants of Jacob, right? And so he gets permission to be able to marry her. And then what's fascinating also there is how, like, if you remember when we spoke about the story of Dinah, we said how Yaakov made a mistake for putting her in the box, like hiding her from Esau, because really she could have changed Esau's ways, and he was punished for that by Dinah getting raped by Shechem. But it was also a positive, like he was also trying to save his daughter. He was also trying, you know, so he was also like rewarded for that, right? So it's kind of like a double side. Like, in other words, yes, that happened, but at the same time, Dinah's daughter was taken care of and ended up back into his family. So and so it's kind of like a come full circle moment. And then Yosef also, we know that he did something really beautiful to show, like, it showed this beautiful connection between son to mother, that when Yaakov was like arranging his whole family, like who's going to stand where, how they're going to go to kind of approach Esau and his army of men, what's going to happen, Yosef actually came out and stepped in front of his mother, like, I'm going to protect my mother. And that was also like something so beautiful that he did. And so he was worthy of marrying Asnat, the daughter of Dinah, who Yaakov tried to protect, right, from Esav. So again, it's like this full circle moment. All right. Questions? Thoughts? I only see Jolie's brain. Like something's going.
I have a question, a thought. It's actually both. In Torah, it refers to Manasseh and Ephraim as Joseph's sons.
Yeah.
But here, if according to the Midrash, that Asnat was really Jewish.
Yeah.
Well, even though the Torah wasn't given yet, why doesn't she get credit for the sons? Why only Joseph?
Well, if anything, like the credit, I mean, it's both, credit is both.
I know credit's a funny word, but.
No, but if any, in Torah, usually it says the father's name. That was the whole question with Dinah. Why does it say Dinah bas Leah? Why does it say Dinah bas Yaakov? Because usually it would say the father's name.
Right.
In Torah. So it's not strange that they're called the sons of Joseph, but now you know that they're the sons of Joseph and Asnat.
All right.
And then, there's this whole, not for now time, but this whole beautiful talk about how Manasseh and Ephraim, these two sons, were raised in Egypt, in this very immoral land, and Joseph and Asnat raised them with such purity that they could be part of Jacob's household. Like it was as if they were around their grandfather, anyway. So that I think is, of course, to both of their credit.
Is that why they get the blessing and not Joseph?
Well, it's a grandchildren blessing. You're talking about the blessing of the grandchildren, you mean?
Yeah. That they get from Yaakov.
Yeah.
Doesn't he give Joseph's blessing to the boys?
Yes. Yaakov gives the blessing to Ephraim and Manasseh, and he said to Joseph, they are also mine.
Okay.
Exactly what Tadina was saying, that although they were raised in Egypt, they were meritorious, they were righteous as if they were raised in Yaakov's tent.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so my question for you now, since this is all we know about Asnat, this is the extent of what we know about her. The Torah only tells, and we know, right, that Torah only tells us what we need to know as an instruction for living our lives, right? Again, there's so much more. Does that leave you with a bunch of like, hey, I want to know this about her and this about her and this about her and what was that like for her? And right, I want to read her memoir. But we don't get that. So why do you think the Torah tells us this? And that's question one. And what do you learn from Asnat after reading the above? And what lessons do you get? I just want to open it up and hear from any of you.
I had always thought that Joseph's sons were glossed over in the Torah. I never knew that about their mother. And so it gives validity to Joseph's line that they had a Jewish mother.
Yeah.
Even though she wasn't raised as a Jew.
Right. I guess we don't.
Well,
like
I'm always
and Ephraim, there's a lot we could say about them. I mean, yeah, I think that they are very powerful, and it's a testament to Joseph and his wife and how they raised their sons, and a lot of nachas, right? Talk about Jewish nachas, like Yaakov had a lot of nachas when he saw his grandsons.
Well, we bless our sons on Friday with those names.
Yeah.
And I was always taught that because they hadn't been raised in the milieu, the Jewish milieu, they were in Egypt, but they turned out good because they were raised well.
Yeah.
And that's why we use their names, even though I'm not sure where else we find them. It's like we don't see them later. I mean, I don't know the story of them later, but it's like, why do we bless our sons on Friday nights using those names? Because they were raised in Egypt.
Yeah.
It's a very good commentary on that. And it's a beautiful. If we from Bereshit to today, we see all the rivalry, all the bickering between siblings. Avram and his family, Yitzhak and his brother, Yaakov, and so on, Yaakov with his brother. And as we just say, and for the next few weeks, we go to talk about Ephraim and Manasseh, but as the assistant of Joseph. But Ephraim and Manasseh is the first set of siblings who didn't have jealousy of rivalry between them. As we just talked all these weeks, we just talk about jealousy, rivalry, and who is stronger, who is better, who is more loved, and etc. And when we bless our children, as all mother we know, that is no more satisfaction than when it's peace and harmony between our children. And when we say it's two ways for this blessing, is because we say one was working and one was learning. So one was supporting the two families. But in their case, they didn't need, they were all working with Joseph and they were well off. But the fact that it was no rivalry, we want our children to be at peace. And there's no better satisfaction for our parents than to see the satisfaction and the peace between and harmony between our children.
Yeah. Yeah, very powerful that we learn from them. All right. Any other thoughts about Asnat and why we might learn this story and why the Torah might tell us this? I'm opening up the floor.
I have a very nice way of putting that all this story, these three last parashiyot we talk about, this one is going up, this one is sold, this one is this one is doesn't like it, and know the story of Asnat. And sometimes we feel like our life, daily life, we don't know what happened to us. We don't know where we're going from there. We don't see our relative, especially today. We stay away from each other. And 20 years ago, when we had children, not all the family came together and everything. But now we realize that even in the Torah, Asnat and Joseph could have been raised together. They could have been in the tent, in the same town and everything. They were two apart. They didn't saw their family and everything for all this year. And 30 years later, let's see, because we just said that Joseph was 30 years old. And then 30 years later, we see that they found each other, they married each other, and they have beautiful family, beautiful children. So in today's life, we see sometimes, we don't see the day-to-day, we don't see what happened in your weekly or monthly, and we don't know where we're going from there. But we see in the Torah that, yes, at the end is a happy ending for all of it.
Yeah, actually, I think.
Adina, it's Tessa. I'm sorry, my computer crashed. I had to restart to get back on, so I missed the last 5 minutes. But taking off what Miriam just said, Barbara and I, Barbara Schwartz and myself, and with a few other women, we're in a class that we do every other week. And right now we're studying Rav Kook with a rabbi in Israel through his podcast. It's most interesting. But the thing that I keep thinking about it, we learned this Monday and I can't get out of this thought pattern. Everything we have done in our lives have brought us to this moment, to who we are now. And that certainly for me describes Asnat. Not only everything that she did in her life, but everything that came before her, the decision of her grandfather, the decisions of her mother. Everything they did affected her and brought her to that point in time where she threw her medallion into Joseph. So that's what that just reminded me of. We don't always know what we have to go through to end up where we are now. We don't understand when we're going through it. What is going on? What is happening? Why am I doing this? But this helps us see an end. It helps us with an explanation. And then, of course, God willing, as our lives continue, there'll be other decisions we make, other things we encounter that bring us to that point in time.
Yes. Yes. Thank you for sharing that. I actually, I'll just share this one quote. I don't know why I would have thought this, but I was like, oh, if we have time, I'll go into the story of Joseph and the wife of Potiphar, because it's, you know, another woman and all connected. But we don't have time. But I'll just share this one other quote, because you just said that, Tessa, right? Where in Yirmiyahu and then the Midrash on that, it says, you have this over here, text number 6, and the Hebrew and the English, Hashem knows that the thoughts he has for the Yidden, the Jewish people, are for good. Even if it looks like not good things are happening, God is planning to bring a wonderful ending. And that, I think, is based on all these stories, right? Where we're like, what is going on here? And really it's like this whole intricately woven kind of a path.
Probably that's my most difficult quote in the Torah. Or in
that one right there?
Yes, because
life.
It's beautiful, but you know, hello, where you know. I mean, it's just a challenge to just dive into that level of faith for me.
Yeah, 100%.
They say that
you're not
life,
alone, Jolie.
Yeah, life is like a tapestry. You see on the front, you see a beautiful picture with all this color and everything. If you go in the back, and anybody who saw knit know that you have all this knot and line going back and forth and tying to each other and hiding between, because this is not the full picture. When you see the front is a beautiful tapestry or a beautiful knitted work of art, but really the back is a lot of knot and line.
God, show us the front.
Yeah.
All right. Okay.
That's keeping on our walls.
I wish you all a wonderful rest of your day. I would love to hear your preferences for if there are any specific topics or series or anything that you're interested in. I did get some emails, but if any of you want to contribute to that before I make my decision. But I hope to see all of you again in January for more Torah and Tea.
So much, Adina.
Thank you. Toda Rabba and happy
Thank you. Happy Hanukkah.
Happy
to
Hanukkah.
everyone.
Bye,
Hag
everyone.
Sameach.
Thank
Stay
you.
safe.